Could you stop shouting your broken English? You're making people uncomfortable. The cafe went silent. Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from, or what time it is where you are. Enjoy this story that might just change how you see the world. The fluorescent lights of Sunrise Cafe buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting their harsh white glow across the worn linoleum floors where Margaret Chen had spent the last 8 months serving coffee to people who looked right through her. At 63, her once proud shoulders now curved forward from years of carrying invisible weight, and her greying hair was pulled back in a practical bun that had long since stopped being about style and become purely about survival. Her uniform, a faded brown polo shirt with the cafe's cheerful logo, hung loose on her shrinking frame. The fabric had been washed so many times that it felt more like paper than cloth, and the name tag reading Maggie was crooked because the pin had broken, and she'd been too embarrassed to ask for a replacement. Her hands, once smooth and graceful when she conducted business meetings in 3 different languages, now bore the permanent stains of coffee grounds and the small burns that came from working too quickly around hot equipment. The morning rush at Sunrise Cafe brought the usual parade of Chicago's professional class. Lawyers clutching their phones, real estate developers in $1,000 suits, and investment bankers who ordered their drinks like they were negotiating hostile takeovers. Margaret moved between them like a ghost, refilling coffee cups and clearing tables, while conversations flowed around her in the language of success she'd once spoken fluently herself. Her section included the corner booth by the window, where the wealthy customers liked to conduct their power breakfasts while watching the city wake up around them. She'd learned to time her approaches carefully, waiting for natural pauses in their conversations, keeping her movements quiet and unobtrusive. These people paid premium prices for their coffee, but what they were really purchasing was the right to exist in a space where service was invisible and their importance went unquestioned. Margaret had perfected the art of professional invisibility. She knew exactly how to angle her body to signal availability without intrusion, how to make eye contact that acknowledged their needs without presuming familiarity, how to smile with just enough warmth to seem human without suggesting she might have opinions or feelings that mattered. After 8 months, she could anticipate orders before they were spoken, could sense mood shifts that determined whether customers wanted chatty service or complete silence. But this Tuesday morning felt different. From the moment she walked through the employee entrance at 5:30 a.m., the air itself seemed heavier, charged with the kind of electric tension that preceded storms. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to shift, though she couldn't have explained why to anyone who asked. She'd been carrying a tray of fresh coffee toward table 7 when it happened. Her English, still accented despite 40 years in America, had been carefully modulated as she offered the daily specials to a table of women discussing their children's private school admissions. The words came out clearly, professionally, with the precise pronunciation she'd worked so hard to maintain, even as her confidence eroded month by month. "Today we have fresh blueberry scones and our seasonal pumpkin spice latte," she'd said, her voice carrying just the hint of her Korean heritage that she'd never quite been able to eliminate, despite decades of speech therapy and conscious effort to sound more American. That's when the man in the corner booth, the one she'd been carefully avoiding because something about his posture suggested impatience and entitlement, looked up from his phone with the expression of someone who'd been personally insulted by her mere existence. David Morrison was the kind of man who believed his success gave him the right to pass judgment on everyone around him. Real estate mogul, political donor, the type who appeared on local business shows to discuss market trends while wearing suits that cost more than most people earned in a month. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his manicured fingers drummed against the table's surface, and his ice-blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who measured human worth by net worth. "Could you stop shouting your broken English?" His voice cut through the morning conversations like a blade, loud enough for every table to hear, deliberate enough to ensure maximum humiliation. "You're making people uncomfortable." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, each syllable designed to strip away whatever dignity she'd managed to preserve during her months of invisible service. The coffee tray in her hands began to tremble, the cups rattling against their saucers with tiny sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence that had descended over the entire cafe. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Margaret felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical pressure against her chest, making it difficult to breathe, impossible to think clearly. Her face burned with shame that spread from her cheeks down her neck, a flush of humiliation so intense she worried she might faint right there on the worn linoleum floor. "I wasn't shouting, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible now, all the careful modulation she'd practiced evaporating under the weight of his public attack. "I was just—" "Oh, really?" Morrison chuckled, the sound devoid of any actual humor, filled instead with the cruel satisfaction of someone who enjoyed wielding power over people who couldn't fight back. He lifted his cappuccino, which she'd brought him only minutes earlier with the same careful politeness he was now mocking, and took a deliberate sip before continuing his assault. "With that accent, everything sounds like shouting. Maybe try speaking American if you're going to work in America." Someone at a nearby table actually laughed, a quick nervous sound that was quickly stifled when the person realized how cruel it seemed. Others looked down at their phones or suddenly found their pastries fascinating, desperate to avoid making eye contact with either the attacker or his victim. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing the injustice, but lacking the courage to intervene. Margaret wanted to explain that English was actually her third language, that she'd been a certified court interpreter for 15 years before her world collapsed, that she'd translated for federal judges and international business leaders who'd respected her expertise and linguistic precision. She wanted to tell them about the years she'd spent perfecting her pronunciation, the speech therapy sessions, the countless hours practicing American idioms and cultural references. But the words wouldn't come. Her throat had closed with shame and rage, and the terrible understanding that nothing she could say would matter to people who'd already decided she was worth nothing more than the coffee she served them. Instead, she turned away from Morrison's satisfied smirk and the sea of faces that looked everywhere except at her. Her feet moved mechanically toward the staff area behind the counter, the tray still trembling in her hands as she struggled to maintain even the pretense of professional composure. Behind the espresso machine, away from the customer's direct line of sight, Margaret finally allowed herself to breathe. The sound came out as a shuddering gasp that threatened to become a sob if she wasn't careful. Her hands gripped the edge of the steel prep counter so tightly, her knuckles went white, anchoring herself to something solid while her world tilted dangerously off its axis. She'd survived so much already: the investigation that destroyed her translation career, the bankruptcy, the loss of her home, the slow erosion of her identity from respected professional to invisible service worker. She'd thought she'd reached the bottom, found a kind of peace in accepting her reduced circumstances. But this public humiliation cut deeper than any previous loss, exposing her to the kind of casual cruelty that reminded her just how far she'd fallen. Through the service window, she could see Morrison had returned to his phone call, dismissing her existence as completely as if the interaction had never happened. The other customers gradually resumed their conversations, though she caught several glances in her direction, some sympathetic, others simply curious about the spectacle they'd witnessed. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember who she used to be before everything fell apart. But that woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime who'd believed in justice and dignity and the possibility that hard work would be rewarded with respect. Now she knew better. The rest of Margaret's shift passed in a haze of mechanical motions and forced smiles. She wiped down tables that didn't need cleaning, refilled sugar dispensers that were already full, and avoided making eye contact with customers who might have witnessed her humiliation. Every task became a meditation on invisibility, a desperate attempt to blend into the background until her 8-hour sentence was complete. When she finally hung up her apron in the narrow employee break room, Margaret's hands were still shaking. The small space smelled of disinfectant and stale cigarettes from the previous shift, its fluorescent bulb flickering intermittently and casting unstable shadows across the peeling paint. She sat on the plastic chair that served as the room's only furniture and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to fall apart, a luxury she'd learned to ration carefully since falling apart completely wasn't an option when you had bills to pay and nowhere else to go. Margaret had always been the type of person who served others with quiet dignity. Even as a child in Seoul, she'd been the daughter who helped her mother with the laundry business they ran from their tiny apartment, translating for customers who spoke only English, mediating disputes with landlords and suppliers. When her family immigrated to Chicago when she was 16, she'd become their bridge to American society, filling out government forms, attending parent-teacher conferences for her younger siblings, explaining cultural nuances that could mean the difference between acceptance and rejection. By 25, she'd worked her way through community college and then Northwestern University, earning a degree in linguistics while supporting her parents and sending money to relatives who remained in Korea. Her professors recognized her exceptional gift for languages, not just the mechanical ability to translate words, but the deeper skill of conveying meaning across cultural boundaries, preserving nuance and intention while making complex concepts accessible to people from completely different worlds. The federal court system had recruited her straight from graduate school. For 15 years, she'd been one of Chicago's most respected interpreters, working on immigration cases that determined whether families would be reunited or permanently separated, criminal trials where precise translation could mean the difference between justice and wrongful conviction, international trade disputes involving millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs. Margaret had translated for 3 different governors, 2 federal appeals court judges, and countless attorneys who trusted her with the most sensitive details of their cases. She'd worked 16-hour days during high-profile trials, maintained security clearances that required extensive background checks, and earned the kind of professional reputation that took decades to build and could disappear overnight. Her colleagues respected her not just for her linguistic abilities, but for her discretion, her reliability, her way of making nervous witnesses feel comfortable while maintaining the precise neutrality that courtroom interpretation required. Defense attorneys specifically requested her for their most challenging cases because they knew she would never allow personal opinions to color her translations, never let exhaustion or emotion compromise her accuracy. But perhaps more importantly, Margaret had been the interpreter who made everyone in the courtroom feel seen and heard. When elderly immigrants struggled to understand complex legal proceedings that would determine their citizenship status, she found ways to convey not just the words but the emotional weight behind them. When children testified about abuse in languages their social workers didn't speak, she became their voice with a gentleness that somehow made their trauma easier to bear. "You have a gift," Judge Patricia Williams had told her after a particularly difficult human trafficking case. "You don't just translate languages, you translate hope." Those words had sustained Margaret through years of witnessing humanity's worst cruelties and finest moments. She'd gone home each night exhausted, but fulfilled, knowing that her work mattered, that she was part of a system that sometimes achieved real justice for people who might otherwise have no voice at all. Her personal life had been quieter, but equally fulfilling. She'd married James Chen, a social worker who understood the emotional toll of working within systems designed to help vulnerable people. They'd bought a small house in a neighborhood where other immigrant families were building American dreams one careful step at a time, where children played in 3 different languages and elderly grandmothers shared recipes that carried the flavors of distant homelands. Margaret had always been careful with money, saving 15% of every paycheck, maintaining an emergency fund that could cover 6 months of expenses, contributing to retirement accounts that would ensure dignity in her later years. She'd learned from her parents' struggles that financial security required constant vigilance, that prosperity could vanish as quickly as it appeared if you weren't prepared for inevitable setbacks. She'd also been the family member everyone called during emergencies. When her younger brother needed surgery he couldn't afford, Margaret quietly liquidated part of her retirement fund without telling anyone. When her elderly mother required expensive medications not covered by insurance, Margaret adjusted her own budget to cover the difference. When neighborhood families faced deportation and needed legal representation they couldn't afford, Margaret used her professional connections to find pro bono attorneys and sometimes paid filing fees from her own savings. "You give too much," James used to tell her, watching her write another check for another family crisis. "You need to think about your own future." But Margaret had believed that helping others was investing in her own future, that the community she supported would support her if she ever needed help, that the goodwill she'd accumulated through years of service would provide its own form of security. She'd never imagined that her entire world could collapse because of someone else's crimes. The investigation had started with a routine audit of court translation services. Budget-conscious administrators wanted to ensure taxpayer money was being spent efficiently, that interpreters weren't padding their hours or claiming expenses they hadn't actually incurred. Margaret welcomed the review. Her records were meticulous, her billing practices conservative to the point of probably undercounting her time. But the audit uncovered something else entirely, a systematic scheme involving falsified invoices, ghost interpreters who existed only on paper, and kickbacks flowing between certain court administrators and a translation service company owned by Margaret's supervisor, Robert Morrison, David Morrison's older brother. The Morrison family had been quietly skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars from court budgets for over 5 years, creating fake translation jobs and billing for interpreters who never actually worked on cases. The scheme was sophisticated enough to avoid detection during routine reviews, buried in the complex bureaucracy of federal court administration, where accountability was often more theoretical than practical. Margaret's name appeared on dozens of documents she'd never seen, her forged signature authorizing payments for work she'd never performed. Her professional reputation, built over 15 years of impeccable service, became evidence of criminal conspiracy. Prosecutors argued that someone with her experience and access couldn't possibly have been unaware of the fraud happening around her. 15 years of perfect records, the federal prosecutor had said during her deposition, his voice carrying the skeptical tone of someone who'd heard every possible excuse for criminal behavior. Never a billing discrepancy, never a complaint about your work, and suddenly we're supposed to believe you knew nothing about systematic fraud happening in your own department. Margaret's attorney, a court-appointed lawyer who seemed more interested in plea negotiations than actual defense, had advised her to cooperate fully with the investigation. Tell them everything you know, he'd said repeatedly. Show them you're willing to help, and maybe they'll consider reducing charges. But Margaret genuinely knew nothing about the fraud. She'd simply done her job, translated accurately, submitted her timesheets through proper channels, and trusted that the administrative details were being handled by people whose job it was to handle them. Her innocence, which should have been her strongest defense, instead became evidence of either complicity or criminal negligence. The media coverage had been devastating. Federal court interpreter indicted in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme dominated local news for weeks. Reporters camped outside her house, interviewing neighbors who suddenly remembered her as always seemed suspicious and kept to herself too much. The Korean-American community she'd served for decades distanced themselves, worried that association with her would bring unwanted attention to their own immigration statuses. Even before the criminal charges were officially dropped, the prosecutors eventually determining they couldn't prove she'd knowingly participated in the fraud, Margaret's career was finished. No court system would hire an interpreter whose name had been associated with such a high-profile scandal, regardless of whether charges stuck. Professional licensing boards launched their own investigations, colleagues stopped returning her calls, and the tight-knit community of legal interpreters quietly erased her from their professional networks. "I'm sorry," Judge Williams had told her during an unofficial coffee meeting 6 months after the scandal broke. "I know you're innocent. We all know you're innocent. But the system can't afford the appearance of impropriety. Your name on a case file would become grounds for appeal, grounds for questioning the validity of any verdict." Margaret had understood. The justice system depended on public trust, and public trust required the appearance of integrity even when actual integrity existed but couldn't be easily proven. Her reputation had become a liability to the very system she'd served faithfully for 15 years. But the personal cost went beyond professional destruction. James, overwhelmed by the constant media attention and fearful that his own social work career would be damaged by association, had quietly filed for divorce. "I can't do this," he'd told her, unable to meet her eyes. "I can't live under this kind of scrutiny. I can't have my clients wondering if I'm connected to criminals." The house they'd bought together went on the market within weeks. Margaret's savings, depleted by legal fees and the inability to work, couldn't cover her share of the mortgage alone. She'd moved into a studio apartment in a neighborhood where sirens wailed at all hours, and the nearest grocery store sold expired food at premium prices. For months, she'd applied for every translation job she could find: freelance work, corporate contracts, anything that might use her linguistic skills. But background checks always revealed the federal investigation, and employers who might have overlooked other types of controversy couldn't risk association with someone connected to court system fraud, even tangentially. "We'd love to work with you," human resources managers would say with apologetic smiles, "but our insurance company won't cover interpreters with any kind of federal investigation in their background. I'm sure you understand. Margaret had understood. She'd understood when her professional certifications were quietly revoked. She'd understood when former colleagues crossed the street to avoid talking to her. She'd understood when her own family suggested she might want to lay low for a while, rather than attending holiday gatherings where her presence might create awkward conversations. By the time she'd applied for the job at Sunrise Cafe, Margaret had been unemployed for over a year. Her savings were gone, her credit rating destroyed, her professional identity erased so completely, it felt like that accomplished woman had been someone else entirely, someone from a different lifetime, who'd believed that hard work and integrity were sufficient protection against the arbitrary cruelties of institutional power. Any previous experience in food service? The 19-year-old manager had asked during her interview, clearly skeptical that someone her age would be suitable for the physical demands of restaurant work. No, Margaret had answered honestly, but I'm willing to learn. She hadn't mentioned her federal court experience, her graduate degree, her 15 years of professional accomplishment. Those credentials belonged to someone who no longer existed, someone whose identity had been dissolved in the acid of public scandal and institutional self-protection. Now, sitting in the cafe's break room with Morrison's cruel words still echoing in her memory, Margaret wondered if that accomplished woman had ever been real at all, or if she'd simply been playing a role that could be revoked whenever it became inconvenient for other people to maintain the illusion of her worth. The following morning, Margaret arrived at Sunrise Cafe 30 minutes early, as she had every day for the past 8 months. The pre-dawn darkness of Chicago's streets felt heavier than usual, pressing against her shoulders like a physical weight as she walked the 6 blocks from her cramped studio apartment to the job that had become both her lifeline and her daily humiliation. She used her employee key to enter through the back door, breathing in the familiar smell of yesterday's coffee grounds and industrial cleaning supplies. The cafe wouldn't open for another hour, giving her time to prepare the brewing equipment, arrange the pastry display, and mentally steel herself for whatever casual cruelties the day might bring. But as she tied her apron and began the opening routine she could perform in her sleep, Margaret noticed something different. A folded newspaper had been left on the break room table, not the usual Chicago Tribune that the manager sometimes brought in, but the Chicago Business Journal, opened to a specific page and marked with a yellow highlighter. The headline made her blood freeze. Morrison Development wins $50 million federal contract for court complex renovation. Margaret's hands trembled as she picked up the paper, her eyes scanning the article with growing horror and recognition. David Morrison, the same man who had publicly humiliated her yesterday, was expanding his real estate empire with a massive government contract to renovate the very federal courthouse where she had spent 15 years of her career. But that wasn't the worst part. As she read further, the connections became clear and devastating. The article mentioned Morrison's family legacy in federal contracting, noting that his older brother Robert had previously managed court administration services before retiring to focus on private consulting. The same Robert Morrison, whose fraud scheme had destroyed her life, was now helping his brother profit from the institution they had both corrupted. Ironic, isn't it? Margaret spun around to find David Morrison himself, standing in the cafe's back entrance, his expensive suit immaculate despite the early hour, his silver hair perfectly styled, his ice-blue eyes holding the same cold satisfaction she remembered from yesterday's humiliation. "How did you—" "The cafe isn't open yet," she stammered, instinctively stepping back toward the prep counter. "I own the building," Morrison said casually, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Master keys, you understand. Very convenient when you want to have private conversations." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized how completely trapped she was. The other employees wouldn't arrive for at least 20 minutes. The front door was still locked and she was alone with a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to publicly humiliate her for sport. "I did some research after our encounter yesterday," Morrison continued, his voice carrying the conversational tone of someone discussing the weather. "You know, when someone with your particular accent starts working in my neighborhood, it makes me curious, especially when they seem so familiar somehow." He moved closer and Margaret could smell his expensive cologne, could see the perfect cufflinks that probably cost more than she earned in a month. "Imagine my surprise when I discovered that the pathetic little coffee server who's been ruining my morning ambiance is actually Margaret Chen, former federal court interpreter. The same Margaret Chen who nearly destroyed my brother's reputation with her incompetence. "I never—" Margaret began, but Morrison cut her off with a gesture. "Oh, please, save the innocent act for someone stupid enough to believe it." His voice hardened, losing any pretense of civility. "You think I don't know what really happened? You think I don't know that you were feeding information to federal investigators, trying to save your own worthless skin by destroying my family?" Margaret stared at him in shock. "That's not true. I never spoke to investigators until they questioned me directly, and I told them I didn't know anything about—" "Liar!" The word came out like a slap. "My brother lost everything because of you. His consulting business, his reputation, his retirement savings, all gone because you couldn't keep your mouth shut about things that weren't your concern. Your brother lost everything because he was stealing money." Margaret's voice rose despite her fear. 30 years of suppressed anger finally finding its way to the surface. "He forged my signature on dozens of documents. He used my reputation to legitimize his fraud. I was a victim, not a conspirator." Morrison laughed, the sound devoid of any warmth or humor. "Victim? You? Look around, sweetheart. You're exactly where you belong. Serving people who are actually important, being useful for the first time in your miserable life." He gestured toward the newspaper still clutched in her hands. "And now I'm about to profit handsomely from renovating the same courthouse where you used to think you mattered. $50 million to modernize the federal court complex, including, coincidentally, completely renovating the interpreter services department where you used to work." The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. Not only had the Morrison family destroyed her career and stolen her identity, but now they were literally profiting from the renovation of the space where she had lost everything. David Morrison would make millions from improving the very rooms where she had once served justice, while she served him coffee and endured his public humiliation. "You want to know the best part?" Morrison stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "Part of the renovation contract includes upgrading the court's interpretation technology, new digital systems, soundproof booths, state-of-the-art equipment that will make the job so much easier for whoever replaces people like you." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, not her heart, but something deeper and more fundamental. The systematic nature of her destruction became clear in that moment. She hadn't just been collateral damage in someone else's crime, she had been deliberately sacrificed to protect the Morrison family's reputation and future profits. "The federal investigators needed someone to blame," Morrison continued, clearly enjoying her visible distress. "Someone whose background made them look thorough without actually threatening anyone who mattered. A foreign-born interpreter with no real connections, no family wealth, no political influence. Perfect scapegoat material. But you were innocent, right?" His voice took on a mocking, high-pitched tone. Poor little Margaret, just doing her job, never suspecting that the white men around her were smart enough to run circles around her limited understanding of how power really works in America. Margaret's legs felt weak, her hands numb. Everything she had believed about her destruction, that it had been an unfortunate consequence of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, revealed itself as naive optimism. She had been deliberately selected for sacrifice, chosen specifically because her powerlessness made her the perfect victim. "My brother made one mistake," Morrison said, his voice returning to its normal register. "He trusted that you were too stupid to figure out what was happening around you. But when the investigation started, you became a liability. Someone who might start asking inconvenient questions, making unwanted connections. So we made sure you'd be too busy surviving to cause any real problems." Morrison smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Margaret had ever seen. "Destroy your career, isolate you from your community, make sure you'd never have the resources or credibility to challenge our version of events." Margaret realized with growing horror that even her current job hadn't been the random act of desperation she'd believed it to be. You arranged for me to work here." "I own this building," Morrison repeated. "I have significant influence over who gets hired in my properties. When I learned you were applying for minimum wage jobs, I made sure you ended up somewhere I could keep an eye on you, somewhere I could remind you daily of your proper place in the world." The morning routine she had thought provided dignity and purpose revealed itself as an elaborate form of psychological torture. Every day for 8 months, she had been unknowingly serving the man who had orchestrated her downfall, performing menial labor for the entertainment of someone who viewed her suffering as a personal victory. "You see, Margaret," Morrison said, straightening his tie with the casual gesture of someone who had just conducted successful business. Some people are born to serve, and others are born to be served. You spent 15 years pretending to be something you weren't, but now you're exactly where you belong. He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back with an afterthought that felt more devastating than everything else combined. Oh, and that little scene yesterday, about your broken English? Morrison's smile widened. I've been planning that for months, waiting for the perfect moment when the cafe was full, when you'd have the maximum audience for your humiliation. I wanted everyone to see what happens to people who forget their place. Margaret stood frozen as Morrison left through the back door, the sound of his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement gradually fading into the distance. The newspaper slipped from her nerveless fingers, falling to the floor where David Morrison's photograph smiled up at her from beneath the headline announcing his latest triumph. For the first time since the federal investigation began, Margaret allowed herself to feel the full weight of her rage, not the helpless frustration of someone suffering random misfortune, but the focused fury of someone who finally understood the deliberate nature of their destruction. She had been played, not just by circumstances or bad luck, but by people who had calculated her worthlessness and engineered her suffering for their own profit and amusement. Her quiet dignity, her willingness to accept reduced circumstances, her determination to find meaning in humble work, all of it had been part of someone else's entertainment. Margaret picked up the newspaper and carefully folded it, her hands steady for the first time in months. She tucked it into her apron pocket, next to the small notepad where she recorded orders, and the pen that had been her only constant companion through 8 months of invisible labor. Something fundamental had shifted inside her. The woman who had entered the cafe that morning, the woman who had spent 8 months accepting humiliation as the price of survival, no longer existed. In her place stood someone who finally understood that dignity could not be earned through submission, that respect would never be granted to someone who accepted disrespect, and that sometimes the only way to stop being treated like a victim was to stop acting like one. The morning rush would begin soon. David Morrison would probably return for his usual cappuccino, expecting to see the same broken woman he had been systematically destroying for 8 months. Instead, he was about to meet Margaret Chen, the real Margaret Chen, who had spent 15 years fighting for justice in federal courtrooms and wasn't quite as powerless as he believed. The morning rush began as it always did, with the familiar parade of suited professionals streaming through Sunrise Cafe's glass doors, their conversations a symphony of stock prices, client meetings, and real estate deals that would shape the city's skyline. But Margaret moved through her duties with a different energy now, her steps more deliberate, her posture straighter, despite the weight of what she'd learned about Morrison's calculated cruelty. She watched each customer with new eyes, wondering how many of them knew about her past, how many had been witnesses to Morrison's systematic humiliation campaign without ever questioning what they were seeing. The comfortable invisibility she'd cultivated over 8 months now felt like a strategic advantage rather than a survival mechanism. At 9:30, David Morrison entered for his usual cappuccino, his silver hair catching the morning light as he surveyed his domain with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he controlled everything within his sight. He chose his regular corner table, the one that provided the best view of both the cafe's interior and the street beyond, settling into his chair with the casual authority of someone who had never doubted his right to occupy any space he desired. Margaret approached his table with the coffee tray, her movements carefully neutral, her expression professionally pleasant. To any observer, she appeared to be the same broken woman who had served him for months, accepting his casual cruelty as the natural order of things. "Your usual cappuccino, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of subservient politeness that he'd been trained to expect from her. Morrison looked up from his phone with that familiar expression of mild irritation, as if her presence was an unwelcome interruption to more important matters. "Try not to spill it this time," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Some of us have important meetings today." Margaret set the cup down with perfect steadiness, her hands showing none of the trembling that had characterized her interactions with him for so long. "Of course, sir. Will there be anything else?" "Yes, actually." Morrison leaned back in his chair, clearly preparing to deliver another public humiliation for the entertainment of his morning audience. "Could you try to speak more quietly? Your voice is particularly grating today." But before Margaret could respond, A new voice cut through the cafe's ambient noise with quiet authority. "Excuse me, but I think you're mistaken." The voice belonged to a woman in her 50s, seated at a small table near the window with a cup of tea and what appeared to be legal documents spread before her. Her dark hair was streaked with silver and pulled back in a practical style. Her navy suit was well-tailored but not ostentatious, and her brown eyes held the steady confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in professional settings. Morrison turned toward the interruption with obvious annoyance. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" "Not personally," the woman replied, closing her legal folder and giving Morrison her full attention. "But I know who you are, David Morrison, Morrison Development Corporation, and I know who she is." She nodded toward Margaret with unmistakable respect. Margaret Chen, former senior interpreter for the Northern District Federal Court. Margaret felt her heart stop. In 8 months of serving coffee, no customer had ever recognized her professional identity, let alone acknowledged it publicly. The woman's casual mention of her former position felt like hearing her own name spoken aloud after months of being treated as if she had never existed beyond her service role. Morrison's expression shifted from annoyance to something approaching alarm. "I think you're confused about—" "I'm Judge Elena Rodriguez," the woman continued, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of managing courtrooms filled with aggressive attorneys and reluctant witnesses. "I presided over several cases where Ms. Chen provided interpretation services. She was one of the finest court interpreters I ever worked with." The cafe's morning conversations began to quiet as other customers became aware that something significant was happening at Morrison's table. Margaret stood frozen between the two speakers, afraid to move or breathe, uncertain whether this unexpected intervention would help or simply create new problems. "In fact," Judge Rodriguez continued, rising from her seat and approaching Morrison's table with measured steps, "I was always impressed by Ms. Chen's professionalism, her linguistic precision, and her ability to convey complex legal concepts across cultural and language barriers. She helped ensure that some of our most vulnerable defendants received fair hearings." Morrison's face had gone pale, but he rallied with the practiced arrogance of someone who had spent his life talking his way out of uncomfortable situations. "Well, that's very touching, but I think you may be overestimating—" "Am I?" Judge Rodriguez pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be official documents. "Because according to the federal court's personnel records, Ms. Chen received commendations from 3 different judges, maintained security clearances that required extensive background checks, and worked on several high-profile international cases." Margaret watched Morrison's confident facade begin to crack as Judge Rodriguez continued reading from her phone. The other customers were now openly staring, their morning routines forgotten in favor of the unfolding drama at Table 7. "She was particularly praised for her work on immigration cases," the judge continued. "Cases where precise interpretation could mean the difference between families being reunited or permanently separated. The kind of work that requires not just linguistic skill, but genuine compassion for human suffering." Morrison attempted to regain control of the situation. "Look, I don't know what point you're trying to make, but the point I'm making," Judge Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the same tone she probably used when ruling on contempt of court charges, "is that you've been publicly humiliating a woman whose professional achievements far exceed your own basic decency." The words hit Morrison like physical blows. Margaret watched his face cycle through expressions of shock, rage, and what might have been the first genuine fear she'd ever seen him display. Around them, the cafe had fallen completely silent, every conversation suspended, as customers absorbed the revelation that their unremarkable coffee server had once held a position of significant responsibility and respect. "Furthermore," Judge Rodriguez continued, apparently not finished with her public demolition of Morrison's character, "I'm curious about why someone with Ms. Chen's qualifications would end up serving coffee to someone whose family has such an interesting history with federal court administration." Morrison stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo in the silent cafe. "I don't have to listen to this." "No, you don't," the judge agreed pleasantly. "You could always leave. I'm sure Ms. Chen would be happy to serve customers who treat her with the respect she deserves." For a moment, Morrison looked like he might explode into one of the angry tirades that Margaret had witnessed him direct at various service workers over the months. His hands clenched into fists, his face flushed red, and his eyes held the dangerous glitter of someone whose carefully constructed self-image was being systematically destroyed in public. But Judge Rodriguez simply waited, her expression calm and expectant, clearly unintimidated by whatever response Morrison might choose to make. The other customers watched with the fascination of people witnessing a car accident, unable to look away from the spectacle of someone receiving the kind of public humiliation they'd probably wished they could deliver to entitled customers themselves. Morrison seemed to realize that anything he said would only make his situation worse. He threw a $20 bill on the table, far more than his cappuccino cost, and stalked toward the exit without another word. But at the door he turned back with a look of pure malice directed at Margaret. "This isn't over," he said quietly, but loudly enough for everyone to hear. Judge Rodriguez watched him leave, then turned to Margaret with a gentle smile. "I'm sorry you had to endure that man's behavior, and I'm sorry about what happened to your career. I followed the investigation, and I never believed you were involved in your supervisor's crimes." Margaret felt tears building behind her eyes, not tears of humiliation or despair, but something she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten the sensation. Tears of gratitude for being seen, recognized, and defended by someone who understood her true worth. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Judge Rodriguez said firmly. "When good people are treated badly, those of us with voices have an obligation to speak up." An elderly man at a nearby table cleared his throat and addressed Margaret directly. "I had no idea you used to work in the federal courts. I've been coming here for months, and that Morrison fellow has been rude to you more times than I can count. I always thought someone should say something." A young woman with a laptop looked up from her table. "I'm a paralegal at Henderson & Associates. If you're ever interested in getting back into legal work, even part-time, I could mention your name to our translation department." One by one, other customers began to acknowledge Margaret's presence in ways they never had before. Not as the invisible service worker who refilled their coffee, but as a person with a history, qualifications, and dignity that had simply been overlooked until someone with authority pointed it out. Margaret realized with stunning clarity that her invisibility hadn't been inherent or inevitable. It had been a carefully constructed illusion, maintained by people like Morrison, who benefited from her being seen as worthless, and passively accepted by others who simply hadn't bothered to look beyond the uniform and accent that marked her as other in their minds. Judge Rodriguez gathered her legal documents and prepared to leave, but paused at Margaret's station behind the counter. "I hope you'll consider returning to court interpretation work. The system lost something valuable when you left, and there are always cases that could benefit from someone with your skills and experience." "I don't think that's possible," Margaret said quietly. "My reputation, the investigation that cleared you of any wrongdoing," Judge Rodriguez smiled. "The one that resulted in no charges being filed against you. I think you might be surprised by how many people in the legal community remember your actual work rather than the gossip that surrounded your departure." She handed Margaret a business card. "Call me if you ever want to discuss it. I know several court administrators who would be very interested in having you back." As Judge Rodriguez left the cafe, Margaret looked around at the space that had been her prison for 8 months and realized it no longer felt like a place of confinement. The other customers continued their conversations, but several nodded to her with newfound respect, and the young paralegal had left her contact information on a napkin. Margaret tucked Judge Rodriguez's business card into her apron pocket next to the folded newspaper containing Morrison's photograph. For the first time since her world collapsed, she began to believe that the woman she used to be wasn't gone forever, that Margaret Chen, respected court interpreter, might still exist beneath the uniform and the accumulated weight of Morrison's systematic humiliation. But more importantly, she realized that she didn't need Morrison's permission to reclaim her dignity. She didn't need his approval to remember her worth. She just needed to stop accepting his version of who she was and start insisting on her own. The next 3 days passed in an electric tension that seemed to charge the very air inside Sunrise Cafe. Word of Judge Rodriguez's public defense of Margaret had spread through the neighborhood's professional network, with the speed that only truly shocking revelations could achieve. Customers who had never given Margaret a second glance now offered hesitant smiles and respectful nods, while others watched her with the curiosity of people reassessing someone they'd completely misjudged. But David Morrison's absence was more unsettling than his presence had ever been. His corner table remained empty each morning, creating a void that felt more ominous than welcoming. Margaret found herself glancing toward the door with growing apprehension, knowing that a man like Morrison wouldn't simply accept public humiliation and disappear quietly into the Chicago morning. On Thursday, her worst fears materialized. Margaret arrived for her shift to find her manager, Kevin, waiting by the employee entrance with the uncomfortable expression of someone preparing to deliver bad news. At 26, Kevin had always treated Margaret with respectful professionalism, but today his usual easy confidence was replaced by obvious anxiety. "Margaret, we need to talk," he said, gesturing toward the small office behind the kitchen where employee meetings were held and disciplinary actions were administered. The office was cramped and windowless, furnished with a scarred desk, 2 mismatched chairs and motivational posters that had probably been cheerful when they were new, but now looked faded and ironic. Kevin closed the door and sat heavily behind the desk, avoiding eye contact while shuffling through paperwork that seemed more like a prop than actual documentation. "I got a call yesterday from the building's management company," he began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone reading from a script he'd been given. "There have been complaints about your performance." Margaret felt her stomach drop, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of complaints?" Kevin looked even more uncomfortable. "Inappropriate behavior toward customers, disrupting the cafe's atmosphere, creating confrontational situations that make other patrons uncomfortable." Each accusation hit Margaret like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because they were so perfectly crafted to destroy her credibility while being impossible to definitively disprove. The encounter with Judge Rodriguez, which had felt like validation and victory, was being reframed as Margaret's fault, her responsibility, her failure to maintain appropriate boundaries with customers. "Kevin," Margaret said carefully, "you were here on Tuesday morning. You saw what happened. Mr. Morrison was the one who—" "Look, Margaret," Kevin interrupted, clearly desperate to get through the conversation as quickly as possible. "I don't make these decisions. The management company says there have been multiple incidents over several months, complaints about your attitude, your communication style, your ability to maintain professional relationships with high-value customers." Margaret realized with devastating clarity that Morrison hadn't been idle during his 3-day absence. He'd been systematically constructing a narrative that would justify her termination while protecting him from any future challenges to his version of events. The management company Kevin referenced was almost certainly controlled by Morrison Development Corporation, making this entire meeting an elaborate performance designed to create legal protection for what was essentially retaliation. "I've worked here for 8 months without a single complaint," Margaret said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "You've never spoken to me about performance issues. I've covered extra shifts, worked holidays, never called in sick." "I know," Kevin said miserably, "and personally I think you're one of our best employees, but this is coming from levels way above my authority. The management company has made it clear that if we don't address these complaints immediately, the cafe could lose its lease." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison wasn't just firing Margaret, he was using his property ownership to threaten the entire business unless she was removed. Kevin and the other employees would lose their jobs if Margaret didn't accept her termination quietly and without protest. Margaret understood the calculation with sickening clarity. Morrison had structured the situation so that fighting for her own dignity would mean destroying the livelihoods of innocent people who had never done anything to harm her. Her desire for justice was being weaponized against her compassion for others. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said quietly. Kevin pulled out a typed document and slid it across the desk with obvious reluctance. "Voluntary resignation. Effective immediately. 2 weeks severance pay. Neutral reference letters if you need them for future employment." Margaret stared at the resignation letter with its corporate letterhead and carefully worded paragraphs that would absolve everyone involved of any responsibility for what was happening to her. The document was signed by executives she'd never heard of from companies she'd never worked for, creating a paper trail that made her departure look like a routine employment decision rather than calculated retaliation. "And if I refuse to sign?" Kevin's expression became even more miserable. "Then the management company will initiate formal disciplinary proceedings. Documented complaints, performance reviews, probably termination for cause within a week or 2. No severance, no neutral references, and a permanent notation in your employment file that could affect future job applications." Margaret felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in around her, options disappearing one by one until only surrender remained as a viable choice. This was how Morrison operated, not through dramatic confrontations or obvious cruelty, but through systematic manipulation of institutional power that made resistance seem both futile and selfish. She thought about Judge Rodriguez's business card, still tucked in her apron pocket, next to the newspaper clipping about Morrison's federal contract. She thought about the paralegal who had offered to mention her name for translation work, about the customers who had finally begun to see her as a person worthy of respect, rather than an invisible service provider. But she also thought about Kevin, who was clearly as much a victim of this situation as she was, and about her co-workers who would lose their jobs if Morrison decided to punish the entire business for her refusal to cooperate with her own destruction. "I need a moment," Margaret said, standing up from the uncomfortable chair and walking toward the door. "Margaret," Kevin called after her, his voice thick with guilt and regret. "For what it's worth, I think this is complete bullshit. You're the most professional person I've ever worked with." Margaret paused with her hand on the doorknob, absorbing what might be the last honest feedback she'd receive in this place that had been both sanctuary and prison for 8 months of her life. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more to me than you know." She walked out of the office and through the cafe's main dining area, past the tables where she'd served thousands of cups of coffee to people who had looked through her rather than at her, past Morrison's empty corner booth, where he'd delivered his calculated humiliations for an audience that had been too comfortable to intervene. The morning rush was beginning, and her replacement, a young man Kevin must have called in at the last minute, was struggling with the espresso machine while customers waited with growing impatience. Margaret could fix the problem in 30 seconds, could save Kevin from the complaints and negative reviews that would inevitably result from poor service during the busy morning period. Instead, she walked to the employee break room and began removing her personal items from her locker. The small succulent plant that had somehow survived under fluorescent lights, the coffee mug with the chipped handle that she'd grown fond of despite its imperfection, the photo of her with James from before everything fell apart, back when she'd believed that love and marriage provided protection against the arbitrary cruelties of the world. As she packed these meager possessions into a plastic bag, Margaret felt something inside her chest crack wide open. Not her heart, which had been broken so many times it had developed protective scar tissue, but something deeper and more fundamental. The part of her that had spent 8 months accepting humiliation as the price of survival, that had convinced herself that invisible work was better than no work, that had believed Morrison's version of her worth simply because he'd repeated it often enough and loudly enough to make it seem like truth. She pulled the resignation letter from her apron pocket and stared at it for a long moment, reading the carefully crafted language that would make her disappearance seem voluntary, routine, unremarkable. Then she folded it in half and in half again and tucked it into her bag alongside her personal belongings. But she didn't sign it. Instead, she removed her apron for the last time, folded it neatly, and placed it on the breakroom table beside a handwritten note that said simply, "Thank you for giving me a chance when no one else would. I'm sorry it had to end this way." Margaret walked out of Sunrise Cafe through the front door, past the customers who were beginning to notice that their service was suffering, past the young man behind the counter who was clearly overwhelmed by equipment he hadn't been properly trained to operate. On the sidewalk outside, she turned back for one last look at the place that had defined her identity for 8 months. Through the large windows, she could see Kevin moving frantically between tables, trying to manage both the front counter and his obviously struggling employee, dealing with customer complaints about slow service and incorrect orders. For just a moment, Margaret felt the familiar pull of guilt and responsibility. These problems weren't Kevin's fault, and the customers didn't deserve poor service just because she'd refused to quietly accept Morrison's latest attempt to destroy her dignity. But then she remembered Judge Rodriguez's words, "When good people are treated badly, those of us with voices have an obligation to speak up." Margaret had been speaking quietly for 8 months, accepting cruelty as the price of survival, letting Morrison define her worth because resistance seemed too dangerous and too selfish. But speaking quietly to power had only encouraged more abuse, and accepting injustice had only invited additional humiliation. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number on Judge Rodriguez's business card. "Judge Rodriguez, this is Margaret Chen. I was wondering if we could talk about those court interpretation opportunities you mentioned." As she walked away from Sunrise Cafe, Margaret heard the sound of the espresso machine breaking down completely, followed by Kevin's frustrated voice trying to explain to increasingly angry customers that there would be delays in their morning coffee service. She didn't look back. For the first time in 8 months, Margaret was walking towards something instead of away from it, moving with purpose instead of simply surviving, choosing her own direction instead of accepting whatever path other people carved out for her. Morrison had made one crucial miscalculation in his systematic campaign to destroy her. He'd assumed that a woman who'd lost everything once would be too afraid to risk losing what little remained. But Margaret had finally realized that what remained wasn't worth protecting if the price of keeping it was accepting the role of victim in someone else's entertainment. Some things, she understood now, were worse than losing everything, and accepting Morrison's version of who she was had become one of them. Judge Rodriguez answered her phone on the second ring, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to making important decisions quickly. "Margaret, I'm so glad you called. Are you somewhere we can talk freely?" Margaret found herself standing on the corner of Jefferson and State, watching the morning flow of Chicago commuters rushing past her toward jobs and lives that suddenly seemed to exist in a different universe from her own. The November wind cut through her lightweight jacket, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel the cold as a personal assault. "I just left the cafe," Margaret said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "They asked me to resign this morning. False complaints, retaliation from Morrison. I didn't sign the papers." "Good," Judge Rodriguez said immediately. "Don't sign anything they put in front of you. Morrison's pattern of behavior needs to be documented, not covered up with settlement agreements and non-disclosure clauses." The judge's matter-of-fact tone suggested she'd been expecting this development, perhaps even preparing for it. "Where are you now? Can you meet me at the courthouse? I have something I want to show you." 30 minutes later, Margaret found herself walking through the marble corridors of the federal building, where she'd once been a respected member of the professional community. The familiar sounds, attorneys' heels clicking against polished floors, the electronic beeping of security systems, conversations conducted in the hushed tones that legal professionals used when discussing matters of life-changing importance, felt both foreign and familiar, like revisiting a childhood home after decades of absence. Judge Rodriguez met her at the Interpreter Services office, a suite of rooms that Margaret remembered as bustling with activity, but now seemed oddly quiet. The walls were covered with certificates and commendations, photographs of court staff at various ceremonies and retirement parties, the accumulated visual history of people who dedicated their careers to ensuring that justice was accessible to speakers of all languages. "Sit down," Judge Rodriguez said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. "I want you to see something that might change your perspective on recent events." She opened her laptop and turned the screen toward Margaret, revealing what appeared to be a legal document with official federal court letterhead. "This arrived in my chambers yesterday. A motion for emergency injunction filed against Morrison Development Corporation." Margaret leaned forward, reading the dense legal text with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years navigating federal court documents. The motion was filed by something called the Coalition for Federal Contract Transparency, and it requested an immediate halt to all work on Morrison's courthouse renovation project, pending investigation into irregularities in the bidding process and potential conflicts of interest. "I don't understand," Margaret said, looking up from the screen. "What does this have to do with me?" Judge Rodriguez smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. "The coalition includes several former federal employees who lost their jobs during the court administration scandal 2 years ago. People who've spent the last 24 months documenting the connections between the Morrison family's various business interests and the federal contracts they've been awarded since the investigation concluded." She scrolled down to show Margaret a section of the document that made her blood freeze. There, in paragraph after paragraph of carefully researched detail, was evidence that the Morrison brothers had been manipulating federal contracting processes for over a decade, using their influence within court administration to steer lucrative renovation and technology contracts toward their own companies. "The courthouse renovation project," Judge Rodriguez continued, "was awarded to Morrison Development despite their bid being nearly 15% higher than the next closest competitor. The technology upgrades for the Interpreter Services Department were sole sourced to a consulting company owned by Robert Morrison, despite federal regulations requiring competitive bidding for contracts over $50,000. Margaret felt dizzy as the implications became clear. They've been stealing from the federal government for years, and using people like you as scapegoats whenever anyone got too close to discovering the truth, Judge Rodriguez confirmed. The coalition has been building this case for 2 years, gathering evidence, documenting patterns, waiting for the right moment to strike. She clicked to another section of the document, revealing a list of names under the heading, Individuals Targeted for Retaliation. Margaret's name was third on the list, followed by detailed documentation of how her career had been systematically destroyed to protect the Morrison family's criminal enterprise. How do they know all this? Margaret whispered. Because several of them went through exactly what you experienced, Judge Rodriguez explained. Court administrators, procurement officers, oversight specialists, anyone who might have been in a position to notice irregularities was systematically removed from their positions and replaced with people who were either complicit or too intimidated to ask questions. Margaret stared at the screen, reading her own story reflected in the experiences of a dozen other federal employees who'd been sacrificed to protect the Morrison family's influence and access. The investigation that had destroyed her life hadn't been about fraud. It had been about silencing witnesses to a much larger pattern of corruption that stretched back years and involved millions of dollars in stolen public funds. The beautiful irony, Judge Rodriguez continued, is that David Morrison's treatment of you in the cafe provided the final piece of evidence the coalition needed to prove their retaliation theory. When someone with his resources and connections goes out of his way to publicly humiliate a former federal employee, it suggests a personal investment in keeping that person silent and discredited. Margaret felt something like hope beginning to stir in her chest, but she'd been disappointed too many times to trust the sensation completely. What happens now? Now, Judge Rodriguez said, closing the laptop and looking directly at Margaret. You have a choice. You can continue accepting their version of who you are, or you can help us prove who they really are. Before Margaret could respond, Judge Rodriguez's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and smiled. Perfect timing. This is Sarah Chen, no relation, despite the name, one of the attorneys representing the coalition. I asked her to join us. Sarah Chen turned out to be a woman in her early 40s, with the focused energy of someone who'd built her career on taking down institutional corruption. Her handshake was firm, her suit was impeccable, and her eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who saw patterns where others saw only confusion. Miss Chen, she said, settling into a chair beside Margaret, I've been following your case since the original investigation. What happened to you was unconscionable, and we're prepared to prove it. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder labeled Morrison Pattern Evidence, Confidential. We have documented proof that the Morrison family has been systematically targeting federal employees for over a decade. Falsified investigations, manufactured complaints, coordinated media campaigns designed to destroy reputations and prevent victims from effectively challenging their narrative. Sarah spread several documents across the desk, pointing to highlighted sections that detailed the Morrison family's methods with clinical precision. They identify employees who pose potential threats to their operations, usually people with access to sensitive information or oversight responsibilities. Then they create circumstances that force those employees into vulnerable positions where they can be easily discredited. Margaret recognized her own experience in the clinical language of the legal documents, the manufactured crisis that had led to the federal investigation, the strategic isolation that had separated her from colleagues and professional networks, the economic pressure that had forced her into minimum wage employment where she could be monitored and controlled. The cafe job wasn't random, Sarah continued. Morrison owns the building, controls the hiring processes for businesses that lease space from him, and specifically arranged for you to work there so he could maintain surveillance and continue the psychological pressure campaign. Margaret felt nauseated as she realized the complete extent of her manipulation. Every aspect of her life for the past 2 years had been orchestrated by people who viewed her suffering as a necessary component of their financial security. But here's what they didn't count on, Sarah said, her voice taking on the satisfied tone of a prosecutor who'd just found the smoking gun. Their need to continue tormenting you has created a documented pattern of harassment that proves their involvement in the original investigation was personal rather than professional. She pulled out a small recording device and set it on the desk. Judge Rodriguez's intervention at the cafe was recorded by another customer, someone who recognized that what they were witnessing was significant and had the presence of mind to document it. Morrison's response, his threats, his obvious personal animosity toward you, all captured on digital audio. Margaret stared at the recording device, understanding that her public humiliation had inadvertently become evidence of Morrison's guilt. The moment that had felt like complete powerlessness had actually been the beginning of his downfall. "We're prepared to file a federal civil rights lawsuit on your behalf," Sarah continued. "Conspiracy to violate your constitutional rights, intentional infliction of emotional distress, interference with economic opportunity. But more importantly, your case provides the foundation for a much larger criminal investigation into the Morrison family's federal contracting fraud." Judge Rodriguez leaned forward across her desk. "Margaret, you have the power to help us bring down an entire criminal enterprise. The question is whether you're ready to stop being their victim and start being the instrument of their justice." Margaret looked around the interpreter services office, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just the place where her career had ended. It was where it could begin again, where she could reclaim not just her professional identity, but her role as someone who ensured that justice was accessible to people who might otherwise have no voice. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady with a conviction she hadn't felt in years. Sarah smiled, and it was the expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "We need you to remember everything. Every conversation, every threat, every instance of harassment. We need you to help us document the systematic nature of their campaign against you and other federal employees. And then," Judge Rodriguez added, "we need you to consider returning to court interpretation work, because when this case goes to trial, we're going to need someone with your skills and experience to ensure that every word of testimony is precisely translated for the jury." Margaret felt the final pieces of Morrison's psychological control crumbling away as she realized the beautiful irony of the situation. His campaign to destroy her credibility and keep her silent had instead provided the evidence needed to expose his crimes. His need to continue humiliating her had led him to reveal the personal nature of his involvement in her professional destruction. And now, the skills he'd tried so hard to suppress, her linguistic precision, her understanding of legal procedure, her ability to convey complex concepts across cultural boundaries, would be the tools used to ensure his conviction. "When do we start?" Margaret asked, and for the first time in 2 years she sounded like the woman she used to be, the woman she was about to become again. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the witness preparation room of the federal building, adjusting the collar of her navy blue suit, not the worn, coffee-stained clothes she'd hidden behind for 8 months, but professional attire that fit properly and commanded respect. Her hair was styled in the elegant updo she'd worn during her years as a senior court interpreter, and her hands, no longer stained with coffee grounds, held a leather portfolio containing the detailed testimony that would help bring down the Morrison criminal enterprise. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first few weeks after leaving Sunrise Cafe had been a careful process of reclaiming pieces of herself that she'd thought were permanently lost. Sarah Chen had connected her with a victims' rights organization that provided counseling specifically for people who'd been targeted by institutional retaliation, helping Margaret understand that her response to systematic abuse had been survival, not weakness. Judge Rodriguez had been even more instrumental in Margaret's professional rehabilitation. Within days of their courthouse meeting, she'd reached out to colleagues throughout the federal court system, quietly but effectively communicating that Margaret Chen was not only available for interpretation work, but came with the personal recommendation of someone whose judgment carried significant weight. "The legal community is smaller than people realize," Judge Rodriguez had explained during one of their weekly coffee meetings. Proper coffee, served in an elegant cafe where Margaret was treated as a valued customer rather than invisible help. "Word travels quickly when someone with your qualifications becomes available again." The first assignment had been modest, an immigration hearing involving a Korean family seeking asylum. Margaret had approached the courthouse that morning with nervous energy, wondering if 2 years away from professional interpretation had diminished her skills, if the confidence that had once come naturally would still be there when she needed it. Instead, she'd found that her linguistic abilities had actually sharpened during her exile. The months of serving customers from dozens of different backgrounds at the cafe had exposed her to regional dialects and colloquial expressions she'd never encountered in formal legal settings. Her ear for accent and inflection had become more sensitive, her ability to bridge cultural gaps more intuitive. "Your interpretation today was exceptional," the immigration judge had told her after the hearing. The family felt completely comfortable, and their testimony came through with remarkable clarity. "I'd like to request you specifically for future cases involving Korean speakers." Within weeks, Margaret's calendar began filling with interpretation assignments. Asylum hearings where precise translation could mean the difference between safety and deportation. Criminal cases where defendants' constitutional rights depended on their ability to understand complex legal proceedings. International trade disputes where millions of dollars hinged on accurately conveying technical specifications across language barriers. But more than just reclaiming her professional skills, Margaret discovered that her experience as Morrison's victim had given her something invaluable, an understanding of powerlessness that made her even more effective at advocating for vulnerable people who found themselves trapped within systems they couldn't navigate alone. "She doesn't just translate words," one defense attorney had remarked to his colleagues after watching Margaret work with an elderly Korean woman charged with Social Security fraud. "She translates dignity. Her clients feel heard in ways that go beyond language." The Morrison investigation had proceeded with the methodical precision of federal prosecutors who'd built their case carefully over years of patient evidence gathering. Sarah Chen had been relentless in documenting the pattern of retaliation against federal employees, creating a timeline that showed how the Morrison family had systematically eliminated anyone who might threaten their access to government contracts. Margaret's role as the key witness had required her to relive every detail of her professional destruction, but this time with the understanding that her suffering served a larger purpose. Each humiliation she'd endured, each moment of powerlessness Morrison had forced her to experience, became evidence of his criminal intent and systematic abuse of power. "Your testimony is crucial," Sarah had explained during one of their preparation sessions, "because you can articulate not just what happened to you, but how their actions were designed to silence you permanently. You understand both the technical aspects of court interpretation and the human cost of their retaliation campaign." The federal grand jury had returned indictments against both Morrison brothers within 6 weeks of hearing Margaret's testimony. David Morrison was charged with conspiracy to defraud the federal government, witness intimidation, and civil rights violations. Robert Morrison faced additional charges related to his role in the original contracting fraud that had been used to justify the investigation targeting Margaret and other federal employees. But perhaps the most satisfying development had been completely unexpected: the revelation that Morrison's systematic harassment of Margaret had violated federal whistleblower protection laws, even though she hadn't initially been seeking to report wrongdoing. His retaliation against her for simply existing as a potential witness to his brother's crimes had created liability under multiple federal statutes designed to protect people who might have information about government corruption. "The beautiful irony," Sarah had explained with obvious satisfaction, "is that his need to continue tormenting you long after you posed any actual threat proved that their original targeting of you was personal rather than professional. That transforms everything from administrative error to criminal conspiracy." Today marked the culmination of months of investigation and preparation. David Morrison's arraignment on federal charges that could result in decades in prison. Margaret wasn't required to attend. Her testimony would come later during the actual trial, but Sarah had invited her to witness the moment when the man who'd systematically destroyed her life would be forced to answer for his crimes. Margaret arrived at the courthouse early, taking time to walk through the corridors where she'd once worked with pride and purpose. The interpreter services office buzzed with activity, and several colleagues she hadn't seen in 2 years greeted her with genuine warmth and respect. Margaret! Elena Vasquez, a Spanish interpreter who'd been a close friend before the scandal, embraced her with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry for how we all abandoned you. We were scared and we let fear make us cowards." "You didn't abandon me," Margaret replied, meaning it. "You were protecting yourselves and your families. I understand now that surviving institutional retaliation requires people to make choices that seem cruel but are actually necessary." Elena shook her head. "Judge Rodriguez told us what really happened, how you were targeted to protect the Morrison family's crimes. We should have stood by you instead of believing their version of events." One by one, other colleagues approached Margaret with similar apologies and expressions of support. The professional community that had cast her out was now eager to welcome her back, not just as a colleague, but as someone whose suffering had exposed corruption that threatened the integrity of the entire federal court system. Your case has changed how we think about workplace retaliation, Dr. Patricia Kim, the court's chief interpreter coordinator, explained during an impromptu coffee break. We've implemented new protocols for supporting employees who report irregularities, and we're requiring anti-retaliation training for all supervisory staff. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. A group of federal employees who'd formed an informal support network for people targeted by institutional retaliation. They'd followed Margaret's case as it developed, using her example to understand their own experiences and find courage to speak out about workplace abuse they'd previously accepted as unavoidable. You showed us that fighting back was possible, one woman explained, that we didn't have to accept humiliation as the price of keeping our jobs. At 10 o'clock, Margaret took her seat in the courtroom gallery, watching as David Morrison was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit that starkly contrasted with the expensive suits he'd worn during his months of tormenting her at the cafe. His silver hair was disheveled, his face pale, and his eyes held the desperate confusion of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed around him. Sarah Chen sat at the prosecutor's table, her posture radiating the quiet confidence of someone who'd built an unshakable case. When she turned to acknowledge Margaret's presence, her smile conveyed not just professional satisfaction, but genuine respect for the courage Margaret had shown in transforming herself from victim to advocate. Judge Patricia Williams, the same judge who'd once told Margaret she had a gift for translating hope, presided over the arraignment with the stern dignity of someone who took judicial corruption personally. When Morrison's attorney attempted to argue that the charges were excessive for what he characterized as routine business practices, Judge Williams's response carried the weight of someone who'd witnessed the human cost of such practices. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice filling the courtroom with quiet authority, "the charges against you include systematic harassment of federal employees designed to prevent them from reporting criminal activity. The court considers such behavior not routine, but profoundly destructive to the administration of justice." Morrison's guilty plea to multiple felony charges took less than 5 minutes to complete, but for Margaret, those 5 minutes represented the restoration of something she'd thought permanently lost. Her faith that justice was possible, even for people who'd been systematically silenced and discredited. As she left the courthouse that afternoon, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her, from serving coffee in Morrison's shadow to watching him accept responsibility for crimes that had destroyed so many lives. The woman who'd been broken by institutional retaliation had been rebuilt into someone stronger, more compassionate, and more effective at advocating for vulnerable people. Her phone rang as she walked down the courthouse steps. Judge Rodriguez's voice carried warmth and satisfaction. "How did it feel?" the judge asked. Margaret paused, considering her answer carefully. "It felt like coming home," she said finally. "Not to a place, but to myself." "Good," Judge Rodriguez replied, "because I have something else I want to discuss with you. The Federal Judicial Center is looking for someone to head their new interpreter training program, someone with your combination of technical skills and understanding of how institutional power can be abused. Interested?" Margaret looked up at the courthouse building, where she'd once lost everything and had now reclaimed something even more valuable than her original career, the knowledge that dignity couldn't be stolen, only surrendered, and that fighting back was always possible for people who refused to accept others' definitions of their worth. "Very interested," she said, and her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned that true power came not from having control over others, but from refusing to let others control you. The building's morning rush continued around her as she walked toward her new life, but now she moved through the crowds with purpose and direction, no longer invisible but impossible to ignore. A woman who'd transformed her suffering into strength and her silence into a voice that would ensure others never had to endure what she'd survived. 1 year after David Morrison's conviction, Margaret stood at the podium of the National Association of Court Interpreters annual conference, looking out at an audience of over 300 professionals who had gathered to hear her keynote address on dignity, resilience, and the power of truth in legal interpretation. The conference hall was elegant, with soaring ceilings and walls lined with portraits of distinguished interpreters who had shaped the profession over decades. Margaret wore a tailored charcoal suit that conveyed both authority and approachability, her greying hair styled in the confident updo of someone who had reclaimed not just her professional identity, but her sense of self-worth. 18 months ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the hall without amplification, I was serving coffee to people who looked right through me, as if my existence was nothing more than a minor convenience in their morning routine. Today I'm here to tell you that invisibility is not inevitable, that dignity cannot be permanently stolen, and that sometimes our greatest defeats become the foundation for our most meaningful victories. The audience listened with the focused attention of people who understood that they were hearing something significant. Many of them worked in similar positions of invisible service, translating not just languages, but hope for people caught in systems they couldn't navigate alone. They recognized in Margaret's story the possibility that their own professional challenges might be overcome, their own worth might be acknowledged, even when institutional power seemed arrayed against them. Margaret had spent the morning before her speech visiting Sunrise Cafe, not as an employee but as a customer with a specific purpose. The cafe had changed management after Morrison's conviction. His property holdings had been seized as part of the federal prosecution, forcing him to sell the building to cover legal fees and restitution payments. Kevin, the former manager who had been forced to terminate her, now worked as an assistant manager under new ownership that prioritized employee dignity alongside customer service. When Margaret entered that morning, his face had cycled through expressions of surprise, recognition, and what appeared to be genuine relief. "Margaret," he had said, approaching her table with obvious nervousness, "I've wanted to apologize to you for so long. What I had to do that day, it wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right, but I was scared of losing everything." Margaret had gestured for him to sit across from her, understanding now that Kevin had been as much a victim of Morrison's systematic manipulation as she had been. "You were protecting yourself and your employees," she had replied. "I understand that now. Sometimes survival requires us to make choices that feel wrong, but are actually necessary." They had talked for nearly an hour, with Kevin explaining how Morrison's arrest and conviction had revealed the extent of his control over local businesses. Property owners throughout the neighborhood had been quietly coerced into discriminatory hiring practices, forced to provide information about employees who might pose threats to Morrison's interests, and pressured to maintain environments where certain people could be monitored and controlled. "The new owners asked me to find you," Kevin had said, sliding a business card across the table. "They want to offer you a consulting position, helping them create workplace policies that protect employees from the kind of retaliation you experienced. They think your perspective could help them build something better than what existed before." Margaret had accepted the card, but explained that her current position with the Federal Judicial Center left little time for additional consulting work. Her role as director of the interpreter training program had expanded rapidly, as courts across the country recognized the need for professionals who understood both linguistic precision and institutional vulnerability. "But," she had added, "I know several excellent consultants who specialize in workplace rights and anti-retaliation policies, people who've experienced what we've experienced and dedicated themselves to preventing others from going through the same thing." Now standing before the conference audience, Margaret reflected on how that conversation had illustrated one of the most important lessons of her journey, that healing from institutional abuse required not just personal recovery, but systemic change that prevented others from experiencing similar trauma. "The Morrison case," she continued, "revealed something that many of us in the interpretation community had suspected but hadn't known how to address, that our profession's emphasis on neutrality and invisibility sometimes made us vulnerable to people who viewed our silence as permission to abuse their power." She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, showing statistics about workplace retaliation against court interpreters and other federal employees. The numbers were sobering. Dozens of professionals targeted for elimination when they posed potential threats to institutional corruption, their careers destroyed through manufactured investigations and systematic harassment campaigns. "But the same qualities that made us vulnerable also made us powerful," Margaret said. "Our ability to understand multiple perspectives, to navigate complex cultural boundaries, to convey meaning across seemingly impossible divisions, these skills served us well when we decided to fight back against the people who had underestimated our strength." The presentation included updates on the coalition of federal employees who had brought down the Morrison criminal enterprise. Sarah Chen had successfully prosecuted not just the Morrison brothers but 17 other individuals involved in the federal contracting fraud, recovering over $40 million in stolen government funds and implementing new oversight procedures designed to prevent similar schemes. More importantly, the case had established legal precedents that strengthened protections for federal employees who reported corruption or simply possessed information that threatened institutional wrongdoing. The Morrison Standard, as it had become known in legal circles, made it significantly easier to prove retaliation even when victims hadn't initially intended to blow the whistle on criminal activity. Justice, Margaret said, doesn't always look like dramatic courtroom victories or public vindication. Sometimes it looks like policy changes that protect future victims. Sometimes it looks like support networks that help people understand they're not alone. Sometimes it looks like the simple recognition that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their accent, their job title, or their immigration status. She shared stories from her work with the Federal Judicial Center, describing interpreter training programs that now included modules on recognizing and responding to workplace retaliation, advocacy techniques that helped vulnerable employees protect themselves, and mentorship networks that ensured no one had to navigate institutional abuse alone. The most powerful story involved a young Spanish interpreter who had contacted Margaret after witnessing what she believed was corruption in court administration. Instead of staying silent and hoping the problem would resolve itself, the interpreter had used the protocols Margaret had helped develop to report her concerns safely and effectively. The corruption was exposed, the responsible parties were prosecuted, and the interpreter's career was protected throughout the investigation, Margaret explained. That's what success looks like, not just individual recovery, but systemic change that makes recovery unnecessary. As her presentation concluded, Margaret returned to the personal elements of her story, acknowledging the audience's need to understand how individual transformation was possible, even within systems that seemed designed to break people's spirits. "I won't lie to you," she said, her voice taking on the intimate tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. "The process of reclaiming your dignity after systematic humiliation is neither quick nor easy. There were mornings when I wondered if accepting Morrison's version of my worth might be easier than fighting for my own truth." She paused, making eye contact with individuals throughout the audience, seeing in their faces the recognition of people who had experienced similar doubts and struggles. "But I learned something crucial during those dark months, that accepting someone else's definition of your value is the only real defeat. Everything else, losing your job, your reputation, your financial security, those are temporary setbacks that can be overcome. But surrendering your sense of self-worth is a choice, and it's the only choice that makes recovery impossible." The standing ovation that followed her presentation lasted several minutes, but Margaret found herself thinking not about the applause, but about the conversations that would happen afterward. Individual discussions with interpreters who had experienced workplace retaliation, networking connections that would lead to new support systems, policy recommendations that would protect future professionals from the kind of systematic abuse she had survived. During the reception following her speech, Margaret was approached by a young Korean-American woman who introduced herself as a recent graduate of a court interpretation program. "Ms. Chen," the woman said, her voice carrying the nervous excitement of someone meeting a professional hero, "your story gave me courage to report sexual harassment I experienced during my internship. Because of the protocols you helped develop, the court took my complaint seriously, and the supervisor was removed from his position." Margaret felt the familiar warmth that came from understanding that her suffering had served a purpose beyond her own recovery. "I'm proud of you for speaking up," she replied. "That took tremendous courage." "It did," the young woman agreed, "but I realized that staying silent would have been harder, because then I would have been complicit in whatever happened to the next intern who worked with him." As the evening concluded, Margaret stepped outside the conference hotel into the cool Chicago night air, the same city where her professional life had been destroyed and ultimately rebuilt into something stronger than what had existed before. The federal building was visible in the distance, its windows glowing with the warm light of people working late to ensure that justice remained accessible to everyone who needed it. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Judge Rodriguez. "Watched the live stream of your presentation. Magnificent as always. Coffee tomorrow to discuss the new victim advocacy position at the Federal Judicial Center." Margaret smiled as she typed her response, looking forward to it. Same place as always. Same place, came the immediate reply. But you're buying this time? Director-level salary has its privileges. As Margaret walked toward her car, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from serving coffee in Morrison's shadow to directing federal programs that would protect countless future victims of institutional retaliation. The woman who had been broken by systematic abuse had been rebuilt into someone whose voice carried authority, whose experience translated into policy, whose survival had become a roadmap for others facing similar challenges. The losses were real. The marriage that hadn't survived institutional pressure, the years of financial struggle, the psychological trauma that would always be part of her history. But those losses had been transformed into a deeper understanding of resilience, a more profound empathy for vulnerable people, and a commitment to ensuring that dignity and justice were not privileges reserved for the powerful. Margaret understood now that true victory wasn't the absence of suffering, but the transformation of suffering into something meaningful, something that served others, something that made the world more just than it had been before. Sometimes the people who try to break you give you exactly what you need to become unbreakable. Sometimes the systems that exclude you reveal their own corruption in the process. Sometimes the voice they try to silence becomes the one that changes everything. Have you ever experienced something like this, where someone tried to make you feel invisible or worthless because of who you were or where you came from? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us share these messages of hope and resilience with people who need to hear them. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.